Glacier Ridge, Montana Territory. November 3rd, 1886. Elena Kowalski, 7 months pregnant and newly widowed, stood in the morning cold watching her neighbors gather at the edge of her claim. She'd been hammering since dawn, and the sound had drawn them like curious ravens to roadkill. What they saw made them shake their heads. Elena wasn't just building one wall for her cabin. She was building two, with a full 18-inch gap between them. Samuel Creek, the settlement's most experienced builder, couldn't contain himself. "Ma'am, I mean no disrespect, but you're wasting good lumber on nothing but empty air. One wall keeps the wind out just fine." His wife Margaret nodded beside him, bundled in 3 layers of wool. "That's double the work, honey. You're in no condition to be working yourself to death over foolishness." Thomas Brennan, who'd survived 12 Montana winters, was more direct. "Lady, that gap's gonna make your cabin colder, not warmer. Cold air settles in spaces like that. You're building yourself an icebox." But Elena kept working, her husband's carpentry tools steady in her calloused hands. She'd learned something from her grandmother in the old country, something these American settlers had never encountered. What did this pregnant Polish widow understand about thermal dynamics that Montana's most experienced frontiersmen had completely missed? Before we reveal the science that would save her unborn child's life, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers worldwide. Elena had arrived in Montana Territory just 8 months earlier, with her husband Piotr. They'd fled the Prussian partition of Poland with nothing but their skills, and the knowledge passed down through Elena's family for generations. Piotr had been a master carpenter in the old country. Elena had learned building techniques from her grandmother, who'd survived the brutal winters of the Carpathian Mountains. Then, in late September, a logging accident took Piotr's life, leaving Elena alone, pregnant, and facing her first Montana winter. She could have returned east. She could have sought shelter with another family. Instead, she began building. The cabin's first wall went up conventionally, full logs, 8 inches thick, chinked tight with clay and moss. Then Elena did something that baffled everyone who passed by. She built a complete second wall, 18 inches inward from the first, creating a continuous air cavity around the entire structure. "She's using twice the wood for half the space," Creek told anyone who'd listen. "That gap's gonna funnel cold air straight down into the living area. Basic science." Martha Jensen, a school teacher from Pennsylvania, stopped by with genuine concern. "Elena, dear, I've read about building techniques. Thermal convection means cold air will circulate in that space. You're creating a chimney effect that'll draw warmth right out of your home." Even Father O'Brien, the circuit priest, gently questioned her approach. "Child, the Lord helps those who help themselves, but he also gave us wisdom. Perhaps you should listen to those with experience in these parts." Elena smiled politely at each visitor, offered coffee she couldn't spare, and continued working. She spoke little English, but she understood their doubts perfectly. What she couldn't explain in words, the winter would demonstrate in temperatures and survival. What Elena understood, and what her critics had never considered, was the principle of thermal mass combined with dead airspace insulation. Her grandmother had called it breathing walls in Polish. The concept was ancient, refined over centuries in the coldest regions of Eastern Europe, where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -30 Fahrenheit. The science works like this. Moving air transfers heat rapidly through convection. Still air, trapped in an enclosed space, becomes one of nature's finest insulators. Air has a thermal conductivity of just 0.024 watts per meter, Kelvin, lower than wood, far lower than stone, exponentially lower than metal. But the key word is still. The gap Elena created wasn't open to exterior wind or interior air currents. It was a sealed cavity, bounded by 2 complete walls. Once the trapped air stopped moving, it created an insulation barrier, with an R value of approximately R5, 5 per inch of thickness. Her 18-inch gap provided nearly R100 of insulation, triple what a single 8-inch log wall could achieve. Creek and the others were partially right about one thing. An open gap would indeed create convection currents, but Elena's design prevented this entirely. The outer wall faced the brutal Montana elements: wind, snow, sub-zero temperatures. The inner wall faced the cabin's heated interior. Between them, the sealed airspace acted as a thermal buffer zone. Heat from inside couldn't easily reach the cold outer wall. Cold from outside couldn't penetrate the warm inner wall. The dead airspace broke the thermal bridge. To understand why this matters, consider the numbers. A single 8-inch log wall has a thermal resistance of about R9. Montana winter nights regularly hit -20 Fahrenheit. With an interior temperature of 65 degrees, that's an 85-degree differential. Through R9 insulation, heat bleeds out at a rate of roughly 9.4 BTUs per square foot per hour. A modest 400-square-foot cabin loses nearly 4,000 BTUs hourly through the walls alone, requiring constant fire feeding and massive wood consumption. Elena's double wall system, with its R100 insulation, reduced heat loss to less than 0.85 BTUs per square foot per hour. The same 400-square-foot cabin lost only 340 BTUs hourly, a reduction of more than 90%. This wasn't theory from a textbook. This was survival math calculated in cord after cord of firewood that wouldn't need cutting, in hours of sleep not interrupted to feed flames, in degrees of warmth that meant the difference between life and death for a newborn infant. The technique wasn't Elena's invention. Her grandmother had learned it from her grandmother, tracing back through centuries of Polish and Ukrainian builders. Similar principles appeared independently across cold climates worldwide. Korean Ondal systems used hollow floor spaces for heat distribution and retention. Scandinavian builders in the far north occasionally employed cavity wall techniques, though few immigrant Scandinavians had brought this specific knowledge to Montana. Plains Indian tribes understood dead air insulation, using it in layered hide construction. The Russians had perfected multi-layer wall systems in Siberia. What united all these traditions was empirical observation refined through generations. Still air stops cold. Elena also incorporated a detail her neighbors completely missed. The outer wall's logs were laid with the growth rings facing outward. This orientation meant the denser, harder wood faced the weather, providing better moisture resistance. The inner wall's logs had growth rings facing inward, placing the softer, more insulating wood toward the living space. This microscopic detail added perhaps half a degree to interior warmth. Small by itself, but combined with the air gap, every fraction of a degree mattered. She calculated her wood needs precisely. The double wall design required approximately 140 logs instead of the 70 needed for a single wall cabin. But her fuel requirements would drop by 2/3 once winter arrived. If a single wall cabin burned 6 cords of wood per winter, her design would need only 2 cords. At the frontier price of $4 per cord for cut and stacked wood, she'd recoup her extra lumber cost in the first winter. Creek and Brennan, watching her work, saw only the upfront cost. Elena saw the lifetime return. By mid-November, the cabin stood complete. The roof was standard: pole rafters, board sheathing, sod covering for insulation and waterproofing. The floor was packed earth, later to be covered with boards if money allowed. But those walls represented something Montana had never seen. December 11th, 1886. The temperature began dropping at sunset. By midnight, it had reached -5 Fahrenheit. By dawn on December 12th, the mercury sat at -18. This was cold, but not unusual for Montana territory in winter. Creek's family woke to a house at 42 degrees, despite burning wood steadily through the night. Brennan's cabin hovered around 38 degrees. Martha Jensen's schoolhouse quarters, attached to the general store, maintained a miserable 35 degrees, even with the store's stove roaring below. They burned wood, they stuffed rags in cracks, they hung blankets over windows. The cold leaked in regardless, seeping through solid log walls, like water through loose weave cloth. Then, on December 15th, the real cold arrived. A high-pressure system settled over the northern Rockies, bringing air down from the Arctic without mercy. The temperature dropped to -32 Fahrenheit. It stayed there for 3 days. Then it dropped further. -38, -41. By December 19th, the official reading at the territorial weather station in Helena was -46 Fahrenheit. Glacier Ridge, at higher elevation and more exposed, was colder still. Creek's family burned through half a cord of wood in 2 days. His children developed frostbite on their fingers despite never going outside. His wife wrapped them in every blanket they owned, and still they shivered. Thomas Brennan's youngest daughter, 4-year-old Catherine, developed a harsh cough that wouldn't stop. The air in their cabin was so cold it hurt to breathe. Brennan burned furniture when his woodpile ran low. Chairs, then a table, then the bed frame from his son's room. He'd never imagined wood could disappear so fast. Martha Jensen abandoned her quarters and moved into the general store proper, sleeping on the floor near the stove. Even there, she woke with ice crystals in her hair from her own frozen breath. Father O'Brien, making his circuit rounds, delayed his departure for 3 days, unable to risk travel in such cold. He witnessed conditions he'd never seen in 15 years of Montana winters. On December 20th, Samuel Creek made the walk to Elena's cabin. The distance was only 300 yards, but the cold was so intense he could barely breathe. He knocked on her door, expecting to find tragedy. Elena answered, 7 days from her due date, wearing a single layer of wool. Behind her, the cabin glowed with warmth. Creek could see her breath, barely. His own breath crystallized instantly in clouds of white vapor. "Ma'am," he said, teeth chattering, "we're worried about you. This cold, it's killing cold. My family, we're burning everything we got, and it ain't enough." Elena smiled. "Please come inside. Warm yourself." Creek stepped through the door, and the difference hit him like a physical force. The air inside wasn't just warmer, it was comfortable. He stood there, speechless, as feeling returned to his face. Elena gestured to a chair near her small stove. "Sit. I bring tea." The stove was modest, burning steadily but not roaring. Creek had seen campfires put out more heat than this little stove, yet the cabin maintained a temperature that felt like a spring day. He looked around, searching for the secret. The walls appeared ordinary from inside. Smooth logs, well chinked, properly fitted. Nothing unusual, except they weren't cold to the touch. In his cabin, the interior walls were ice cold, conducting Montana's fury straight through 8 inches of wood. Here the inner wall felt almost neutral, barely cooler than the room itself. Elena returned with tea. Creek wrapped his frozen hands around the cup. "Ma'am, I got to ask. It's got to be -40 outside. What's the temperature in here?" Elena pointed to a small thermometer hanging on the wall, a wedding gift from Pyotr's family. 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Creek stared at the instrument. His cabin, with a fire 3 times larger burning constantly, couldn't maintain above 40 degrees. This woman, alone and heavily pregnant, was living in comfort he couldn't achieve with 4 people working round the clock to feed flames. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button and comment below telling me what historical building technique you'd like me to investigate next. Your engagement helps me bring more forgotten knowledge to light. The truth was empirical and undeniable. Elena's double wall design, with its 18-inch dead air cavity, was performing exactly as centuries of Eastern European builders had known it would. Creek examined the stove fuel consumption. Elena was burning roughly 1/5 of a cord per week, maybe 40 pounds of wood per day. Creek's family was burning through 120 pounds daily and still freezing. The math was brutal. Elena's design was operating at 6 times the thermal efficiency of standard construction. Creek wasn't a scientist, but he understood survival economics. He asked Elena to explain. She struggled with English technical terms, but she drew pictures in the ash box of her stove. 2 walls, big space, air not moving. "Air stands still," she said, searching for words. Still air is like blanket. Many, many blankets. Creek understood. He'd experienced the same principle in a different context, snow caves. Miners and trappers knew that a snow cave, despite being made of frozen water, was warmer than open air because the snow trapped still air in its structure. Elena had built the same principle into her walls, but permanent and superior. Over the next 3 days, as the cold persisted, Creek spread the word. Neighbors who'd mocked Elena's construction now came to see for themselves. Thomas Brennan arrived with his coughing daughter. He stood inside the doorway and wept. My girl's been sick for a week in air so cold it burns. She's standing here in shirt sleeves and the color's coming back to her face. Martha Jensen came with her notebook, documenting everything. As a teacher, she understood she was witnessing applied physics that most textbooks never mentioned. She measured, questioned, and recorded. Interior temperature during the coldest period, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Exterior temperature, -46 Fahrenheit. Differential, 110 degrees. Wood consumption, approximately 8 pounds per hour. Equivalent single wall cabin, estimated 48 pounds per hour minimum. Father O'Brien arrived on December 23rd. He blessed the cabin and called Elena's survival Providence working through wisdom. Then he asked the practical question everyone was thinking. How much would it cost to add a second wall to an existing cabin? Elena, through broken English and Creek's translation, explained the technique in detail. The numbers were precise because survival demanded precision. For a standard 400-square-foot cabin, adding an exterior second wall required approximately 70 logs, 8 feet long and 8 inches in diameter. Local lumber cost, $1 per log, $70 total. Labor, if hired, approximately $30 for skilled carpenter working 1 week. Total cost, $100, equivalent to about 25 cords of firewood at frontier prices. Payback period, less than 2 winters, given the fuel savings. But there was a critical limitation. You couldn't simply add an exterior wall to an existing structure and expect the same results. The air cavity needed to be properly sealed, top and bottom. Any opening that allowed air to circulate would destroy the insulation effect. For existing cabins, the better approach was building an interior second wall, sacrificing some living space, but gaining far more in thermal efficiency. Creek did the calculation for his own home. Losing 18 inches of interior space around his perimeter would reduce his floor area from 450 square feet to roughly 350 square feet. But his family would be warm. His children wouldn't have frost-bitten fingers. His wife could sleep through the night without waking to feed the fire. The trade was obvious. Brennan reached the same conclusion. I've been burning my furniture, he told Creek. Another few days of this cold, and I'd have been burning the walls themselves just to keep Catherine alive. $100 and some lost floor space. I'd spend twice that and sleep in a closet if it meant my family survives. The cold broke on December 26th. The temperature rose to -10, then to +10 degrees over the following days. Montana's Arctic siege had ended. But the lesson remained, carved into the memory of everyone who'd suffered through those 2 weeks, while Elena remained comfortable in her double-walled cabin. By mid-January 1887, 17 families had approached Elena with requests for information. She shared everything freely. Creek, Brennan, and 4 other men became students of her design, learning the critical details. The outer wall needed to be completely sealed, no gaps where wind could enter the cavity. The inner wall needed the same. Top and bottom required blocking to prevent air circulation within the cavity, while still allowing trapped moisture to escape slowly. This was the subtle part. The cavity needed to breathe just enough to prevent rot, but not enough to allow air movement that would destroy insulation value. Elena demonstrated the solution her grandmother had taught her. Small weep holes at the bottom of the outer wall, drilled at a downward angle, allowing moisture drainage but preventing wind entry. At the top, similar holes drilled upward from the inner wall allowed moisture escape while preventing convection currents. These holes were roughly 1 inch in diameter, spaced every 8 feet around the perimeter. They seemed too small to matter, but they prevented the trapped air from becoming saturated with moisture while maintaining the still air insulation principle. Creek built the first retrofit. He constructed an interior second wall in his cabin, losing precious floor space but gaining thermal mass. The work took 10 days. The next cold snap arrived in late January, mild by December standards, only -15 Fahrenheit. Creek's family slept comfortably at 58 degrees inside. His wood consumption dropped from 40 pounds daily to 12. Brennan completed his retrofit by early February. Martha Jensen convinced the store owner to add a second wall to her quarters. Father O'Brien wrote to the territorial newspaper about Eleanor's design, calling it wisdom preserved from old world necessity, applicable to new world conditions. By spring 1887, 43 buildings in Glacier Ridge and surrounding settlements had incorporated double wall construction, either as retrofits or new builds. The technique spread through word of mouth, validated by empirical results no one could dispute. Elena gave birth on December 27, 1886, to a healthy daughter she named Maria. The baby's first weeks of life were spent in stable temperatures averaging 62 degrees, conditions that would have been impossible in standard Montana construction during that brutal winter. Creek's wife Margaret later told anyone who'd listen, "That baby would have died in my cabin. I couldn't keep my own children warm with their fingers. A newborn? No chance. Elena's walls saved that child's life." The fuel savings across the community were substantial and measurable. Creek tracked his wood consumption meticulously. Before retrofit, approximately 6 cords per winter. After retrofit, 2 cords per winter. Savings, 4 cords per winter at $4 per cord equals $16 annually. His retrofit cost, $95 for materials and self-labor. Payback, 6 winters, but with immediate comfort benefits that made the investment worthwhile from day one. Brennan's numbers were similar. He'd spent $110 on his retrofit, including paying Creek to help with construction. His fuel savings were even more dramatic because his cabin had been particularly drafty. He went from 7 cords per winter to just under 2 cords. 5 cords saved annually, $20 saved. His payback period, 5.5 winters. But more important than money, his daughter Catherine's respiratory problems diminished significantly. Breathing cold air night after night had damaged her lungs. In the warmer cabin, she recovered. Brennan later wrote in a letter to his brother back east, "I was wrong. This works." A Polish widow taught Montana how to survive winter. The adoption continued beyond Glacier Ridge. Miners in the nearby mountains heard about the technique and applied it to their shacks. Trappers modified the design for temporary winter shelters, using canvas or hide for the outer wall to save weight while maintaining the air gap principle. One innovative rancher named David Porter created a variation for his barn. He built a double-wall hay storage structure, using the same dead air principle to prevent freeze damage to his stored feed. The hay stayed dry and accessible all winter, eliminating losses to ice and rot. The community's attitude toward traditional knowledge transformed. These were practical people, farmers, miners, laborers who valued results over theory. They'd dismissed Elena's design because it contradicted their experience and looked like waste. The winter of 1886 taught them a harder lesson. Their experience was incomplete. What worked adequately in Pennsylvania or Ohio wasn't optimal in Montana territory. Other immigrant families began sharing their own traditional techniques. A Norwegian family demonstrated log corner joints that interlocked without nails, stronger than American notch and spike methods. A German stonemason showed how to build masonry stoves that radiated heat for 12 hours after the fire went out. A Scottish family's knowledge of angles and chimney draft improved everyone's fireplace efficiency. Elena became a quiet hero, though she never sought attention. She raised Maria, maintained her cabin, and eventually remarried, a widowed rancher named William Foster, who'd lost his wife to cholera. They combined their properties and built a new house using Elena's double-wall principles from foundation to roof peak. That house, expanded several times over the decades, still stands today on what's now called the Foster Ranch, 15 miles northeast of modern Glacier Ridge. The original double wall section is preserved as a historical feature. Modern thermographic imaging has confirmed what Elena knew from experience. The cavity between walls shows minimal thermal transfer even today, more than a century later. Elena Kowalski Foster died on March 18, 1931, at age 72. Her daughter Maria lived until 1978, often telling the story of her mother's first Montana winter. Maria's children and grandchildren continued the tradition of double wall construction. When modern insulation materials became available, fiberglass, foam board, spray foam, the Foster family recognized them as improvements on the same principle their Polish grandmother had brought from the Carpathian Mountains. Still air stops cold. The principle is the same whether the air is trapped between log walls, within foam cells, or inside fiberglass batting. Contemporary building science has validated Elena's design completely. The modern double-stud wall technique, popular in cold climate sustainable building, uses the identical concept. Two framed walls with a cavity between them, filled with dense packed cellulose or other insulation. R values of 40 to 60 are common, exactly what Elena achieved with nothing but logs and trapped air. Research from the Cold Climate Housing Research Center in Alaska and the Passive House Institute confirms that thermal breaks and increased insulation depth are the two most effective strategies for extreme cold climate building. Elena understood both principles intuitively, taught by generations who'd survived winters that killed the unprepared. What's remarkable isn't that the technique worked. Elena's grandmother knew it worked. What's remarkable is how close this knowledge came to being lost. Elena spoke little English. She had no formal education. If she'd died in childbirth that December, or if she'd given up her claim and returned east, Montana builders might have continued their inefficient methods for decades longer. How much traditional wisdom has been lost because we failed to listen? How many immigrant families carried solutions to American problems but were dismissed as ignorant foreigners? The story of Elena's walls is also a story about humility and the limits of expertise. Creek, Brennan, and the others weren't stupid. They were experienced builders with years of Montana winters behind them. But their expertise was incomplete, and their confidence made them certain they were right. It took crisis and empirical proof to open their minds. That pattern repeats throughout history. Established experts resisting innovation until reality forces acknowledgement. Today, the principle Elena brought to Montana informs building codes across cold climates worldwide. Minnesota requires minimum R49 wall insulation for new residential construction, roughly equivalent to Elena's 18-inch dead air cavity. Alaska and northern Canada have even higher requirements. Sweden and Finland, building some of the world's most energy-efficient homes, use cavity wall techniques that Elena would recognize instantly. The Passive House Standard, considered the gold standard for energy efficiency, mandates thermal breaks and thick insulation assemblies that embody the same physics Elena's grandmother taught her. Modern materials have improved on 19th century methods, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. Still, air stops cold. Thermal mass stabilizes temperature. Broken thermal bridges prevent heat loss. Elena knew this in 1886. Science has spent the last century proving she was right. The human cost of ignoring traditional knowledge is incalculable. How many children suffered frostbite because pride prevented learning from immigrants? How many families burned excessive wood because experienced builders rejected unfamiliar techniques? How many lives were endangered by the assumption that American ways were automatically superior to old world methods? Elena's story challenges that assumption directly. She was young, foreign, female, widowed, and pregnant, everything the frontier valued least. Yet she possessed knowledge that saved lives and transformed building practices across the territory. The men who mocked her weren't evil. They were limited by assumptions they'd never questioned. Crisis forced them to see beyond those limitations. We face similar challenges today. Climate change demands new approaches to building, agriculture, and resource management. Indigenous peoples and traditional cultures worldwide hold knowledge refined over millennia. Are we listening? Or are we repeating the mistake of Samuel Creek and Thomas Brennan, certain our modern expertise is complete, dismissing traditional wisdom as primitive superstition? Elena's double walls offer a metaphor beyond building technique. They represent the value of cross-cultural knowledge exchange, the importance of humility in the face of expertise, and the need to preserve traditional wisdom before it disappears with the last generation that remembers it. Give this video a like, hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate. Next time, we're diving into the story of a Chinese immigrant who revolutionized California agriculture with ancient water management techniques that his American neighbors called impossible, until the drought of 1898 proved him spectacularly right. Until then, remember, sometimes the best innovations are centuries old, waiting for someone humble enough to learn them.